Okay, we're good. We're good now. Wonderful. So we are finally live. That's wonderful. So okay, let's get started then. This is a long-awaited interview, so I'm really excited. So uh, today with me, I have a very special guest. I have a socialist, an activist, a writer, and he's also a regular contributor over at Black Agenda Report. They do great work. And he is also the co-author of a very important book that we're going to discuss today, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence. I have none other with me than Danny Haiphong. How are you doing, Danny? It's good to have you.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm doing all right.
That's great. That's great to hear. We have a lot to discuss. Uh, there's so much going on right now with these protests, with a lot of labor action being undertaken in the U.S. Just last week, the last couple of weeks, the Iran nuclear deal and sanctions. Lots of things going on abroad, domestically. I wanted to get your take on a few of those, but could you just start off by defining the title of the book, the difference between American exceptionalism and American innocence? Because I think a lot of people are familiar with the term American exceptionalism. I mean, not a lot in the U.S., but I think people struggle to understand the difference between the two. Could you just lay it out for them? What's the difference?
Sure. So American exceptionalism is an ideology. It's really the foundational ideology of the United States, and people around the world are very familiar with this ideology. And I would argue that people in the United States are very familiar with this ideology. It's just that there is a lot of consent to this ideology in the United States. So it's not so much so seen as something that is political in character. It's rather seen as factual. But American exceptionalism is really the ideology that defines the United States as the most advanced civilization, the most democratic society, and basically the most, how should I say it, just the most admirable society, an honorable society, one that all other nations and peoples should really emulate. And American innocence is less offensive in the sense that it doesn't seek to project knowing and knowledge and an understanding of the United States so much as it is really a response to criticism, a response to the reality and the disconnect between American exceptionalism and the reality on the ground. So, for example, we just had the Kenosha shooting, the police shooting of Jacob Blake, and then we had Mr. Rittenhour, the white nationalist who, shot at protesters and is now being almost rendered innocent, so to speak, by the media. Even some progressive media have been arguing that, oh, he was attacked and this and that. But we see this all of the time when it comes to instances of racism, or really anything that happens in the United States or what the United States does abroad, where a crime, a war crime, a crime of exploitation, a crime of racism is exposed, and the response in kind by the ruling elite is to then use its massive apparatus, its ideological apparatus, its state apparatus, to turn the narrative on its head and to basically condition us to believe that whatever the United States does, even if it commits crimes, that those who are either, bringing up these crimes, the so-called sources, are not legitimate, whether because
Yeah.
heard this a lot with people who are defending Syria. They're Assadists, for example. So you delegitimize the source, or you, and usually, actually, then you victimize the perpetrator. So the United States acts oftentimes as a victim. Its ruling elite always acts as a victim. We see that now with China. We see it with Syria. We see it with countries around the world. And we also see it in the United States, where whenever Black people are on the move, Black people are then demonized and criminalized. And when they're killed, they're demonized. and criminalized in order to make it so we believe, okay, well, that cop might have killed or tried to kill Jacob Blake, killed so many young Black men and women in the past, but these Black men and women were criminals, but these Black men and women had guns or whatever it may be to justify it. So really American Innocence is the defensive, I would say, ideology of the United States. It really kicks in when the multitude of crimes the United States commits come into question and are much more visible, which today I think is no more relevant than any other period.
Yeah, that's very eloquently put, and all the more striking. You hear it all the time, as you said. Just last week with Jacob Blake, for example, they start bringing up the victim's criminal past. Instead of focusing on the perpetrator. And this is not just a case of when it's police shooting civilians. It's regardless. Even you saw this with George Zimmerman, if I recall correctly, that's his name. They tried to make it out as if he did something in self-defense. And, it's always Black people's fault. It's always Arabs' fault. It's always the victim's fault. And they start digging through their past, trying to look for, criminal convictions or something they said, instead of focusing on the perpetrator. It's absolutely unreal. It's really an exceptional, no pun intended, phenomenon. And I don't mean that in the good sense. It's quite disgusting. And as you said, it really is some kind of, disconnected from reality defense mechanism. And I'd like you to explain how that applies with the wars, because, we don't even hear about that in the first place. For example, in the book, you talk about how 9/11 had an impact on the whole world, right? So everybody had to feel empathy and sympathy and compassion for the United States. But when people are killed in drone strikes, or their villages are napalmed, or entire towns are wiped off the map, we don't even hear about that. And in the few moments we do, there's always a justification.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, the United States, as your viewers probably know, is the imperial hegemon in the world, and it has been since the end of World War II. And it has been the arbiter of endless war around the world, the leader in that. So I guess it's exceptional in that way. But every single instance of U.S. incursion, of U.S. Interference in the affairs of the peoples of the world always carries with it this need to, one, render the United States innocent of any crime it commits in the process of its interference, and two, to ensure that initially the project, whether we're talking about the project for the new American century that justified a lot of the invasions and destruction of the war on terror, whether we're talking about the broader Cold War from the end of World War II all the way until the Soviet Union fell in 1991, or whether we're talking about now with this new great power competition that the United States is waging with Russia and China, there is first the ideological basis of rendering the project one that has values attached to it, which everyone should ascribe to and everyone should get on board with, right? So the democracy, that's a big one. It's always, we're bringing democracy, we're protecting national security. So now It's about people in the United States feeling secure. And really what all of it usually boils down to is an internationalized white supremacist justification for destroying other countries at the behest of multinational capital and the banks. And that can't be said, right? Because then the ruling class would really reveal their hand. But we've seen that with Venezuela, for example, and John Bolton saying, well, we're really there for the oil. We've seen it happen. But I think that tends to be why the Trump administration can ruffle feathers with the ruling elites. It's not because he isn't serving them and doing a good job in many respects in doing so, but it's really because sometimes he and his administration says things and does things that the ruling class really doesn't want to have public, because that ruins this public relations image that American exceptionalism is really about. So the wars, we can go on and on, the whole list. I mean, the United States has overthrown or attempted to overthrow over 50 plus governments in as many years. And that number only rises the more that the United States exists as this imperial hegemon. But every single time it is conducting an imperialist operation, a war, there is this demonization campaign, right? The Assad regime, the Maduro regime, the dictatorial Chinese, the dictatorship in China, the Putin regime. It's really to dehumanize those countries, right? We're just dehumanizing those countries. They don't have human beings there. They don't have a right to self-determination. They don't have any. They are really just peoples who need to be saved by the United States, who need the democracy, who need the imperial medicine. And when the crimes, for example, the tens of thousands who have died from sanctions in Venezuela and Iran, when we see the destruction like we see in Iraq and Syria, when those crimes bubble up to the surface, then it's about, well, that government is bad anyway. That's just collateral damage, right? The drone strikes, the collateral damage is a huge part of the drone strike campaign, which continues. So yeah, when it comes to wars, American exceptionalism is such a critical piece because unlike domestic policy, where you have a class society, so you have contending interests, and many people really do, unfortunately, agree with things like austerity, depending on where they sit. Racism is a huge thing here. But when you can try to unite everyone under the banner of democracy in order to fulfill an imperial project where many people see it as their benefit to have done, right? So there are people who do believe that, and this is a historical process, that if the US remains an imperial hegemon, then things will be better here in the United States. And that's not without precedent. It's not as if the wars that the US wages abroad, especially from the period of 1945 to 1973, didn't have material benefit for a lot of people, even some working people. And so there's that imperial contradiction. You've called it American privilege in some respects. And I think that's a big part of this as well, in terms of the buy-in, or even when it's not a buy-in, it's a lack of resistance to, right? It's just something that's there and that happens and that's expected, these wars, but
this acquiescence essentially
to resist, right? Solidarity, right, exactly. Solidarity is not really on the table because the people who are targeted by imperialism are so dehumanized, and our way of life is supposed to be the pinnacle of humanity in its most advanced form.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy. And as you pointed out, this employment of the word regime, I always found this so funny because, I mean, for me, when I was growing up, I was watching the Iraq War unfold and build up on television. I mean, I lived in war zones myself, but when it comes to the propagandization of seeing how build up to a war, justification for a war was being done on television, and not just in the US, but in the UK, I saw how they would constantly repeat terms like, oh, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. 45 minutes, this myth that Saddam can mount an attack against the UK in 45 minutes. And of course, the word regime. And so they've been using that always for Iraq, for Syria, Venezuela, and now Mike Pompeo goes around saying that the Chinese Communist Party lies when he himself admits that he lies and the CIA lies and they're taught to lie. You know the clip. And also, their new tag, their new slogan, their tag phrase is Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. They, as you said, they try to dehumanize the governments and, by extension, the people in these countries, right? So I always found that quite transparent to me because I've been witnessing it since a young age, and it's really disgusting. But a lot of people don't actually realize what's being done here, and that this has been nailed down to a science, and they know exactly what they're doing. And speaking of dehumanization, in the book you talk about the beginnings of the United States when you had English settlers coming over, massacring and committing genocide against the Native Americans, the real Americans, the indigenous population. And could you tell people a bit more about that, about the dehumanization and how people have become so acquiescent and just they just accept what happened, and they just assume that this land was empty and it was just for the taking.
Yes, it's a very familiar narrative for many people in the Arab world, because that's the narrative that Israel has used, and Israel has really marketed itself as basically a second coming of the United States in terms of its ideological base. So yeah, no, I mean, in the book, we try to highlight the amazing works of people like Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz and Gerald Horne, who have really attacked and criticized the origins on the left will defend the United States' origin story as even if slavery and the genocide of Native people was a fact of life during the ascendancy of the US, that because the values of democracy and republicanism, et cetera, were part of that project, that it was still an advancement. I mean, look, I'm a socialist and I know many Marxists who say this. And it's very troubling because, as these great scholars have helped us understand, is that actually there was vibrant resistance to chattel slavery. There was vibrant resistance to the genocide of indigenous people, both of which really shaped the formation of the United States itself. I talk about the 1772 Somerset case, where there was an escaped slave from Virginia who ended up in London, and then the courts in London ruled under English common law that slavery was not going to be a determining factor, and they would not return him back to his captors. And the colonialists here on the mainland took real and a huge objection to this. And this was part of a historical process where white supremacy, as the founding basis of the United States, where there was no so-called, especially in this time, it has formed now, this so-called buffer class of Africans or Native people or oppressed people who sort of mitigated between the two. The English and other colonial powers were beginning to arm Africans, were beginning to build a class of free Blacks and free Natives inside of their colonies because it was a necessity to stop rebellion. And the colonialists here in the United States had huge issue with that. They thought they were being enslaved. And we've heard this narrative before. We hear it now today, right? The whole demographic shift in the United States has a lot of that narrative to it. Oh, we're going to be enslaved by, Blacks and Latinos. We're going to be victims of China, right? Because China's a growing power. There's this
the irony,
imaginative, yes, exactly. This imaginative idea of white insecurity in a lot of ways that that there's going to be this backlash against the system, which, to be fair, even though the basis, the ideological basis is not rooted in fact, the fact of the matter was slaves, Native people, they didn't necessarily take to being super exploited and oppressed as they were during this period. So there were many slave rebellions and there were heads rolling. And so these slave rebellions really did scare the United States, what became the United States, the colonialists here. They wanted to stop them at all costs. There was huge activity among Africans on the Spanish Florida, in between with Georgia. There was the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1738. There were so many instances of slave rebellions, which made the colonialists, many of whom had escaped slave rebellions themselves in the Caribbean, in places like Antigua, in order to get safe respite here in the white majority country, or white majority colony, that form the basis of the United States itself. So when people say, hey, we got to defend the values of democracy and freedom and liberty, you're really defending the foundations of the United States, which are rooted in racialized slavery, which are rooted in racialized genocide and colonialism, and that those legacies still are omnipotent and very much present to this day. If we just look at the Black condition in the United States, if we just look at how Native people still live in squalor, are still gunned down by the cops, are still living in a settler colonial situation. No land has been returned. There has been no reparations for slavery. We can go on and on and on about how the situation for those oppressed people who were the victims of the American project just continue to live in, it's an understatement to say second-class citizenship, to live in an exploited and oppressed condition. And so I think these ideologies are really also, when it comes to American exceptionalism, are really also a way to erase existence, right? There are many people who don't think Native people exist in the United States, right? Just like those folks who can't find DPRK or Syria on a map. A lot of these folks also don't think Native people exist.
Yeah,
they also
insane.
think that Black people have won their freedom, right? There's all of these myths and lies, and all of them center around this project of the United States improving over the course of history, when circumstances may be different, but improvement can be a stretch in many respects.
Yeah, and you drew a parallel between what happened in the U.S., what is still ongoing, and what's happening in Israel and Palestine. A lot of people frame it as a conflict instead of what it really is, which is a colonialist settler project, a military occupation. They think that Palestinians and the Zionists are on a level playing field, as if Palestinians have a navy and tanks and the support of the world's hyperpower, or foremost superpower. It's ridiculous. And so one thing that I really found interesting in your book is that you pointed out back in the 50s and 60s, and how, just generally speaking, historically, Black rights movements and African-American movements in the United States were actually staunch supporters of the Palestinian cause, and that this has been lost. It's not really brought up today at all. Could you talk a bit more about that? Because it's really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. We wanted to highlight the alternatives, right? We didn't want to just condemn the United States as an empire that masks itself in this ideology of American exceptionalism. We also wanted to show that this systematic erasure of resistance is a key part of the project, that we were outlining a key part of the development process of the United States. So we wanted to highlight the fact that actually, when we look at the course of history, in the United States especially, there have been vibrant resistance movements and social movements, and the Black liberation movement has been maybe the most formative one. And we don't hear that a lot in the progressive space right now, even because right now the Black liberation movement is unfortunately at a low, and that's not a coincidence. And it's because of exactly what you said, the solidarity that the Black liberation movement has at its basis of reaching out to peoples around the world. Huey Newton and the Black Panther Party visited Palestine, supported the PLO in its liberation struggle against the Zionist colonizers. There are so many examples of this as well. And we just have, I think, a more internationalist perspective when we look at the history of the Black liberation movement, which is so important. Even today, right, we had the movement for Black lives for however, in terms of ideology, it doesn't always necessarily get into an ideological struggle, but the movement for Black lives even committed to solidarity with Palestine. And that's right, because there is this longer history of the Black liberation movement and just Black people in general being more progressive, just historically. I mean, this is just a fact. Even to the days back during the period of chattel slavery, before the so-called American Revolution, there were strategic moves to align with whichever colonial power, whenever there was a conflict, Africans would make the decision to win their freedom and fight their colonizer in order. So there was always, in order to gain freedom, and there was always this idea that if you can reach out and extend your relationships beyond the situation that exists where you are, that you can be stronger. And I think this is reflected in so much of the political leadership of the Black liberation movement, especially prior to the 1980s, where you had people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson traveling around the world, speaking out against imperialism, speaking out against anti-communism, and forging relationships of solidarity, even going into exile in places like Cuba, like Robert Williams and Assata Shakur to this day is in exile in Cuba. So I think when we look at that movement, and Palestine, of course, has always been a huge part of the internationalist movement, whether it's led by Black people or others, that's really the antidote to these ideologies, right? The only way you break out of, and I've had direct experience with this, right? Meeting Syrian Americans, even here in the United States, fighting the US-led war there, going to China and meeting people who have a completely different perspective and are organizing their lives in a different way. I think there has been a lot of good done when people do reach out and make connections with others around the world who are on the receiving end of imperialism, because then you start to see the connections, right? That's the common enemy that you have with capital, with the US state, and you begin to see that the people who are on the receiving end of these aren't evil, they're not corrupt, they're not inherently trying to undermine your situation, right? Muhammad Ali had that famous line about, the Vietnamese never called me the N-word. So, you have all these examples where internationalism has been very successful in countering this ideology. And with Palestine, I mean, right now, with everything that's happening, it's so important because, I get frustrated. I feel like, the thing with the two-state solution, and there's been a lot of kind of using the Palestinian struggle as almost like a jumping board for liberalism in some senses. And it feels very familiar, right? Because in the United States, you had this liberation movement led by Black people, and you had then you had forces saying, well, we just need to, kind of live within this structure and make it so everyone feels included. But when we have a situation like the United States or in Israel where inclusion basically means colonization, basically means oppression.
Exactly.
Then how does that really change the situation? And how does that change the material conditions on the ground? If the answer is not at all or not very much, then we are left with what I think exists too much today, which is this deep nihilism and despair and this kind of normalization of what's happening, right? This frustration that doesn't go that doesn't really have anywhere to go. And so, yes, the historic feature of Black internationalism in the United States, and how that's been, and this is another part of the story, so repressed, right? The ability to make connections with Palestine and the Palestinian Liberation Movement, the DPRK, Cuba, China, right? Like these very strategic maneuvers made by forces within the Black Liberation Movement were seen as one of the biggest threats that existed here in the United States, right? You had people like W.E.B. Du Bois had their passport removed.
Right.
He stayed in Ghana, but he was trapped in Ghana. Not a lot of people know that.
It's insane.
He went to Ghana, he couldn't come back. And while he, of course, supported Kwame Nkrumah and the independence government there was a literal assault, a very anti-communist assault, and a very anti-Black assault on the revolutionary movements that existed and that have emerged here. And I think that's not really talked about. It's not even talked about by a lot of progressives, right? It's almost like history didn't happen. There isn't this history. And American exceptionalism in its racist roots have a lot to do with it, because there isn't a lot to be won materially, financially, in terms of if you want the algorithms to like you, you're not gonna on YouTube or whatever, you're not gonna do very well talking about Black revolution. You're not gonna do very well talking about political prisoners in the United States, because to do so exposes the entire foundations of what this empire is about.
Yeah, precisely. And, speaking of retribution and punishment, people having their passports canceled. I mean, Edward Snowden is probably the most recent example of that. They trapped him in Russia on purpose, I would say, because it would be much easier to smear him as working for the Russians based off on that. But in general, people who bring up the struggles of the global South, of minorities in the Western world, they get punished. And I mean, as you said, even just talking about the crimes committed by Western powers in Syria, for example, oh, you're immediately Assadist. Or, you know, if you talk about the crimes being committed against Palestinians, oh, you're anti-Semitic, which is actually hilarious considering Palestinians and Arabs are Semites themselves. So I don't know how that computes, but okay. You know, drawing also parallels, I don't think it's just a question of standing in solidarity with each other because it's the right thing to do, which it is. But nonetheless, if you look at, for example, just 2 days ago, I don't know if you saw this, there's a 60-year-old man in Palestine. His name is Khairi Hannoun, and he was just protesting peacefully. And clearly on video, you can see him being forced to the ground. They rip off his headdress and his flag, and they started, you know, choking him, putting the knee on the neck, just like we saw with George Floyd. And so you start digging, and it becomes very apparent that not only are these struggles linked through the injustices that are imposed on these people, but on Palestinians and on African Americans, but also they're being committed by the same people. I mean, U.S. cops receive extensive grants and amounts of money and training from Israelis. They teach them these techniques. What you saw happen to George Floyd, this excessive disproportionate brutality, is taught by the same people, is done by the same people. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, and you, of course, you noted in the book that Obama and Biden gave out $38 billion to the Israelis, which is not the first aid package. I mean, they've had the backing of the U.S. since the beginning, but it was the largest to date. And I mean, not only is that ridiculous in the sense that you're depriving your own citizens in the U.S. of health care and higher wages and things that will benefit their infrastructure, but that you're just funding and directly responsible for genocide and oppression elsewhere. And so it becomes very clear that these struggles are linked and being executed and undertaken by the very same people. And so I think that's why it's really important to shine a light on that. And I really appreciate that you did in the book. And, you know, speaking of progressives, I found it really interesting how they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk, as they say. So you heard AOC, for example, at the DNC convention, she mentioned the word colonization, you know, and that got my attention because, I mean, just the word itself, you don't hear that often. But okay, she'll talk a good one, but where's the action? You know, she was trying to pull military ads from Twitch, for example. And on the surface, you might think that's a good thing. But why doesn't she talk about pulling aid to Israel or pulling the funding from these bioweapons research facilities? You know, the U.S. has, the Pentagon has like 25 research centers spread out across the world for bioweapons. Or AFRICOM, which you also bring up in the book. You have the vast majority of countries in Africa occupied by U.S. military troops, and people don't even know about that. And so what I'd like your take, what I'd like to hear you talk about is, what do you think of all these progressives who say they're anti-war, who claim, oh, they're going to go up against the military-industrial complex, but they're never really bringing attention to, let alone exposing things like US aid to the oppression of Palestinians or all of these shadow wars? What do you think of progressives' stance? Are they anti-imperialist enough, if at all?
Well, very good question. I mean, it's one of the most frustrating things I think about this moment. You know, just real quick, another example of solidarity, as you were talking about with Palestinians and the Black struggle here is, you know, in 2014 and during the Ferguson Rebellion, we had Palestinian activists tweeting to Black activists how to handle tear gas canisters, which are chemical weapons,
right,
to ensure safety. And that was one of the most beautiful moments. I think really did help lay the basis for solidarity. So when you do have that extension and that reaching out, it does make a big difference. But to your question about AOC and the rest of the so-called squad, Bernie Sanders, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, you know, in our book, we really make it clear that the Democratic Party is the engine of American exceptionalism right now. Everything that the Democratic Party does, its opposition to the Trump administration, the way that it talks about the United States, the way that it formulates policy, it's all about preserving the rule of the rich and preserving the rule of capital and the rule of its racist institutions, while at the same time framing its struggle against the so-called opposition, the Republican Party, as almost a reformative project, one that will bring the United States back to where it should be, right? Into a place where it is now once again exceptional. So by painting the Trump administration as bad, right? Trump bad, that's basically the Democratic Party's line.
Yeah.
It can escape accountability for what it is doing and what they are doing to ensure that not only people like Trump become stronger and stronger and stronger politically, but that the entirety of the society remains the same racist, capitalist, imperialist society that it's been for centuries, and that the trajectory for ordinary people, working people, oppressed people, gets worse and worse and worse. And AOC and the squad, unfortunately, because the movement, I don't think, was strong enough or ideological enough to really get out in front of this, when they entered the Democratic Party apparatus, they basically ceded the entirety of the ground for so-called progressivism. So
right.
None of the policies domestically that they argue for, while they can be tolerated within Washington as a debate in some respects, although they really don't get any space to do that, and they don't say much about that either. The Green New Deal, Medicare for all of that, that's allowed to an extent that it's ineffectual. It will never happen as the system is currently constructed. So the Democratic Party basically tolerates their existence in that regard. But when it comes to imperialism, there is no wavering on that. And the Democratic Party makes that very clear, that the war machine must not only be protected and sanctified, but it has to be expanded. And if you're not on board with that, you are not in Washington, D.C. So that, I think, explains why AOC, and not to mention some of the pitfalls historically of the so-called democratic socialist trend, which has a history of supporting wars. We saw it during Libya, we saw it during Syria, that there is this buy-in, and I think part of that is that American exceptionalism infects many white people, even the most left of white people. And so it's very attractive to say, oh, Syria, Assad is butchering people, and Gaddafi is giving Viagra to soldiers to rape women and children, and oh, look at those WMDs, or oh yeah, China, those, the yellow people over there that have this dictatorship, they're, destroying Africans and destroying Muslims and China. All of that is very attractive when you don't have any resources or sources to get a different take on things. And at the same time, you're looking to organize people where they are, and most people get the same sources of information as them. And so I think when it comes to AOC and the squad and the progressives, there's just a whole lot of opportunism in the sense that if they rock the boat with Nancy Pelosi and with the imperialist establishment in the Democratic Party, then they don't have a seat in office. So they are willing to sacrifice this part of the political struggle in order to forward their careers. And it's very devastating because on the one hand, while you have Ilhan Omar opposing, certain interventions, going after regime change efforts, against Latin America, for example, or all about the Benjamins and AIPAC, she will at the same time talk about evidence-free claims of repression of Uyghurs, or she'll say that Syria is this dictatorship that is oppressing its own people, right? So there is this virtue signaling towards the Democratic Party establishment that we are not going to challenge the real power brokers in Washington, D.C., because that would basically sacrifice their careers entirely.
Yeah, and Ilhan Omar, she also backed this AIPAC-sponsored letter to renew the arms embargo on Iran, which failed catastrophically just 2 weeks ago in the UN Security Council. So, at the same time, she used to go after AIPAC, supposedly, and she caught a lot of flack for it, right? They were calling her anti-Semitic, and then I don't know if that was all an act or if that was enough to, make her toe the party line and silence her for the rest of her career, and that's why she went on board. But it's ineffective. This doesn't help anyone, right? And speaking of that letter, it's all connected because who wrote that letter? Elliot Engel, and he was unseated by Jamal Bowman. And so for me, being an Arab, my cousin is Palestinian as well. I went and I checked out his foreign policy. I want to know, what is Jamal Bowman all about? And 1 week before he unseats Engel, he gets criticized by a rabbi in the Jerusalem Post, if I'm not mistaken. I covered this before, but just briefly, he was anxious that Israel was going to lose their friend Elliot Engel, who is, one of their top dogs in AIPAC in the Zionist lobby. And so he was concerned about some milquetoast, mild, banal comment that Jamal Bowman had once made, saying that, he doesn't like the mistreatment of Palestinians. That's putting it mildly. And so Jamal Bowman responds with, "Don't worry, I oppose BDS." I'm like, oh, wow, what a progressive, wonderful. Like, just right from the get-go, he is making it really clear that he is against BDS. And then Barack Obama said that he loved this letter so much, this open letter, where Jamal Bowman states that he is against BDS, which is the most peaceful, nonviolent form of protest you could possibly undertake, and which was successful against apartheid South Africa. Obama loved this so much that he came out and endorsed Bowman because of it, which shows you once again how deep-seated the racism is against Palestinians and how deep-seated the support for the Zionist occupation is and the Zionist lobby. And so that's also something that happened just recently and just further solidified, for me at least, and I think for anybody paying attention, how unwavering progressives are in regards to anything remotely anti-imperialist. Once again, BDS is extremely peaceful. It's like you can't win if you're Palestinian, right? Even if you just participate in a boycott, they will come out and condemn you. And as you saw, Ro Khanna, Ayanna Pressley, they all voted to condemn it. It's a catastrophe. And so speaking of the role of progressives in government, you saw how they voted in regards to the stimulus package and gave away trillions of dollars to the wealthy. I was wondering about your take on this. Do you think that this lack of a social safety net, this giving the middle finger essentially to the working class, giving them one measly check, no health care, just not even budging an inch on the status quo, do you think this has woken people up even slightly? Do you think it's going to lead anywhere? Because you see a lot of protests in regards to what happened to George Floyd, to Jacob Blake. You see a lot of protests happening, but what about having a general strike? You don't hear anything about real worker mobilization and worker action from these leaders. And, you pointed out in the book, which I found really interesting, is that even in the height of World War II, you had tens of thousands of wildcat strikes. This is during World War II, workers were still going on strike. And now you don't see that anywhere. You've had labor unions decimated. Only 10% of American workers are actually in unions. So what is it going to take for progressives to start leading worker action? What is it going to take for that to come from the people themselves? Do you think that this crisis right now, the recession, the protests, and COVID are going to make any kind of substantive change in U.S. politics domestically or not?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. It's hard to predict exactly where things will go, but there is a lot that we can kind of observe, which helps us understand some of the challenges, I think, to the type of movement that you're speaking of, right? The type of class struggle-oriented movement, which is very much absent in the sense of having any real power right now. Not to say that there aren't activists or organizations doing the work, but in terms of having power and the ability to influence politics, not so much. And so we have to look at all of the different factors. And one of the reasons we wrote the book, and we were very explicit, is that there has been a lot of upsurges and insurgencies, right? The Sanders phenomenon is one of them. Occupy Wall Street was another. The Black Lives Matter protests in 2014 to 16, and then leading into this, the latest iteration of the uprising against police brutality, right? None of those things.
Sorry, just to cut you off. I just want to be clear. I'm not trying to diminish or denigrate those movements at all. On the contrary, I'm just curious, like, why haven't they taken a real foothold, and why are progressives not actually, lifting them up and trying to help propel them to success? So just to say that, go ahead.
Oh yeah. No. I definitely, I get this. Our our interest in writing the book, and I also think your interest in it, is also in how do we advance the movement, because that's wholly needed right now.
Yeah.
And that's why we intervene with this book ideologically, because that's part of the issue, is that there's still a lot of baggage left from decades and decades of outright repression, soft power repression, this ideological assault on working people that has been coupled with a devastating campaign of austerity and endless war and mass incarceration. We are really living in, especially, the Sanders movement, quote unquote, Sanders movement, they like to talk about neoliberalism and the economic situation, but we have to look at the total situation, the entire spectrum of what's going on. And when we look at the trajectory of the United States, it's concentration of capital leading to mass misery for the majority of working people. You also have this racist war, basically a war of terror on Black people, on people all over the world. And then you have the ideological assault, the concentration of the media that has aligned with the concentration of capital, the capturing of all spaces, including college campuses, mind you. I mean, college campuses used to be vibrant sites of activism. Now they're mainly vibrant sites of reproducing the elites. And that's always been the case to some respect, but there used to be a period when that wasn't the case. So there has been an assault on all of the institutions where people could organize, whether you said, unions, whether we're talking about student movements, whether we're talking about the Black liberation movement, there's been a counterinsurgency campaign. I talk about this a lot. Counterinsurgency warfare is part of American exceptionalism. It's part of this U.S. project, this U.S. transition to neoliberal capital, to basically terminal capitalism, right? This endless, rapacious path toward enriching the banks and going for short-term profits and feeding monopoly capital at the expense of everyone. There's so many facets to this that we have to observe all together and connect the dots, because if we do not, then we will succumb to the fact that labor law is completely organized against labor unions and workers to be able to strike, right? That's a huge component as to why more strikes don't happen, because there is a lot of leeway and freedom for employers to do whatever the hell they want to workers if they decide to do that. Or we talked about the mass incarceration state. Why is the Black liberation movement not at the point that it was maybe in the 40s, 50s, 60s, during the Jim Crow period, during the so-called civil rights period? Well, look at the character of the mass incarceration state. Look at what police are doing. And then look at the Democratic Party basically capturing a segment of Black leadership and using them as a proxy for the establishment and basically tampering down expectations. That's been a huge part of this endless austerity, this endless war that imperialism wages. It's dampening expectations, getting people to accept that the situation may not improve in the way that they may like, but at least it won't get worse. And so this lesser evilism, and we got to vote blue no matter who, the Democratic Party is the only organ of social change. I think that really is the principal issue right now, is that because of the concentration of power, the Democratic Party is now serving as the big tent for supposedly progressives. And a lot of people have not learned the lesson yet that the Democratic Party is the graveyard of social movements. It's not going to build up your movement. It is going to absorb it. It's going to destroy it. And then it's going to redirect it so that you're actually serving the interests of capital and the interests of the elite. And I think until we have that break, because we are really at this inflection point where we're not going to see a change in the way that the ruling elite does things. We'll see a change in the approach and in the way that it looks in public relations terms, but we will not see a change in the policy arena, right? They're not just going to give Medicare for all just because people are dying and people don't have health insurance. They're not going to release prisoners or political prisoners because it's too costly, all of this stuff. It's never going to get to the point where those things change. We're more likely to see an escalation of terrorism in the forms of war and racism, et cetera, because more and more people are suffering from the system. And in order to control the situation, in order to make sure that rebellions like the one that has happened here in the United States doesn't get to the point where we want it to get, we want these ideological conversations. We want the organization to become firm and to break from the Democrats, all of that. But in order to stop that, there is this counterinsurgency campaign. We saw it with the NBA strike, Obama picking up the phone and really intervening in that. Michael Jordan the same way. It's, wherever movements and rebellions happen, that's going to be the dynamic. So we always have to be building forces that are advanced enough to be able to explain that and to be able to pull people away from the attraction of, just throwing up your hands and say, okay, I'll go for Biden now because there's no other alternative, right? There is no alternative. That's been the mantra for so many decades.
Yeah, it's crazy. And as you mentioned, the Democratic Party is really de facto a graveyard for any kind of worker movements or civil rights movements. And there really has been an extensive effort undertaken by the entire political apparatus, not just Democrats specifically, but the entire political apparatus across the last century, if not longer, to dismantle these movements. I mean, you saw this with the FBI, for example, and their counterintelligence program. Now, of course, yes, this is also serving the purpose of their interests in potential double agents and spies, but it's been used mainly to dismantle Marxist movements, feminist movements, black rights movements. They kept a file on Martin Luther King, for God's sake. I mean, anyone, Hollywood actors or actresses that open their mouths in favor of workers and minorities will be targeted, journalists, everyone. And so there's definitely been an extensive effort. And I'm sure you know the Taft-Hartley Act, which they passed to make sure that communists can't run as union leaders. And it's still a law. This is still an actual law. And you read this stuff and it just blows your mind. It really blows your mind. And it's really a shame seeing that these huge coalitions of socialist, communists, unionists, the CIO disintegrate. And a lot of people, and I see this right now, this is still ongoing, have a nostalgia for FDR as if he was some kind of hero, because they think that he was the champion of workers' rights because he gave them the New Deal and a federal jobs program. But they actually don't realize that he did this with the goal of saving capitalism in mind, right? The entire purpose was to prevent a revolt. People forget that at the time, this is the 30s. You've just had a successful Bolshevik revolution in the biggest country on earth, in Russia. You're having all of these Marxist movements spring up everywhere, and so people being inspired by that, and also on top of it, going through the Great Depression, were just at the end of their wits. And to prevent a revolt and an overthrow of the ruling elites, he placated them by giving them the New Deal, and then absorbed and cut the heads off all of these movements. And they went for the communists immediately after 45 to even stigmatize to this day the word socialism and the word communism. So like anything even remotely related to workers is taboo, right? That's really something. And I was actually going to ask you about this, and you just mentioned it. Obama picking up the phone to sabotage this NBA strike. Why do you think that happened? And why is Obama always moving behind the scenes, even after he's out of public office, technically speaking, right? Why is he still intervening in politics? Getting all of these Democratic primary challengers to coalesce behind Joe Biden, and even stating publicly, that he would intervene to do that. And now sabotaging another worker action by NBA players. What's up with that?
Obama is the counterinsurgency president. That's what he served as. His whole political career has been about, especially when he was being cultivated as the 2007-2008 candidate, to basically complete the rupture of the what Black Agenda Report calls the Black consensus on war and social justice, especially this principle of opposing war and always being for peace. That's been a consensus within the broader Black community, political or not, for a very long time, since arguably the inception of the United States. And when Obama came into office and the propaganda, the heavy assault of shaping Black politics in the image of Obama came into being. I remember I was, I think I was 17, 18 at the time when he was running. You saw it everywhere in Boston, the Boston area when where I was at the time. You know, this equation of Obama with Martin Luther King, with you know, the civil rights movement, the straight line drawn from Obama to the civil rights movement and the struggle of the past. All of that was very effective, right? Because by that time, there had been a desperation. The conditions in the Black community had gotten so bad, things had gotten so bad politically in the United States that there was this need to basically disintegrate that consensus on social justice and peace that exists in the Black community. And so we see every time there is an uprising, every time there is a potential where this backwardness, this backward political trend, right? We had during the Obama administration, Black Americans polling to support the war on Syria that the Obama administration was proposing in 2013, the red line. Black Americans supported that to a greater degree than white Americans in a CNN poll, for example. So there was this shift that had never occurred, right? Black Americans, 70% plus always opposing Iraq, opposing Afghanistan, all of that. But it shifted so dramatically, and that's how effective he was, such an effective evil in distorting progressive politics, in attacking all levels of left politics, but especially with an emphasis on the Black movement. So when the NBA players conducted this strike, and you know, this isn't new. I mean, Barack Obama has been very vocal, has been trying to shape the direction of the uprisings from 2014 onward. We see him picking up the phone in regards to NBA players, because NBA players are 70% Black plus. Like the NBA is a majority Black sport, and many NBA players come from communities where the oppression, the continued subjugation, the racism is still very much present. And so there is a relationship, and his whole objective is to intervene so they see their careers and they see him as an example, as being just as much part of their commitment to Black people as the fight against oppression itself. And that's why he intervened, because it was potentially a huge moment. I think that there are, of course, a lot of racists in the United States that can't understand it, but also I think there's just a lot of misconceptions. I mean, not even a lot of progressives, a lot of people who support Sanders, even the progressive media, not covering it at all, as if that strike had continued, it wouldn't have had a monumental impact, not just on the economic situation in the United States and on the class struggle, but also on mass consciousness in relationship to this uprising, right? It would have moved things forward monumentally. And Obama understood that. Not a lot of people on the left or progressives understood that. And it's because there's this prejudice that NBA players are supposedly high paid. If you look at, I think you mentioned this in your coverage on it, look at how NBA players are paid in comparison to the profits they bring in for owners and for advertisers. It is minuscule. Like LeBron James, for example, there's a reason why he gets so angry. And it's because even though he's one of the highest paid NBA players, he is underpaid compared to
he's still being exploited. Like, you know, that's capitalism by definition. Underpaid. But even these stars, it's unreal. It's crazy.
He is underpaid. And, you know, for Black celebrities, which have been called, you know, have been kind of absorbed into what Black and Gender Report calls this misleadership class, right? Appendages of the Democratic Party that kind of champion American exceptionalism and don't challenge really forward a lot of the most reactionary policies. NBA players and you know, Black celebrities as a whole have been, there's been a concerted campaign to capture them, right? They are honestly, you know, a lot of times ridiculously, really out in front politically a lot of the times, because there's this expectation amongst the ruling elite that they need to be politicized. They need to always be out in front. And so I think when Obama saw that NBA players were getting out in front in a different direction, that he had to step in because his influence, there's no one in this country, there's no political figure in this country with more influence on Black politics than Barack Obama. And I think that's understated in terms of how it's talked about even in the most progressive circles.
Right. And in your book, you spoke of Colin Kaepernick's protest and how even the fact that he dared to kneel, which I really can't think of a more peaceful protest than that. I mean, you're not even opening your mouth. You are literally kneeling. Like, how dare you? They treated it and blackballed him from the industry and vilified him as if he had, burned the Constitution or something, right? They treated it as if it was a crime upon the nation. And I think that's very telling. And you underscored that in the book, because people were angry because he dared to attack something that is implicitly part of American exceptionalism and part of the American culture and psyche, which is that, the status quo, these injustices make up the fabric. And so if you dare to speak out against America by kneeling during the anthem or, disrespecting the flag, that's a big one you hear, right? That you are attacking the fabric of the nation itself. And so even with that protest, which was the most calm, sincere, most plain and nonviolent form you could do, he was being vilified. And they kicked him out of the industry. So when I saw what Obama did, I was like, man, this guy, he made moves behind the scenes. He did this because it had such potency and it was going to go and it was going to have a real impact. And, I was reminded of how, in question in terms of profits, right? I mean, in capitalism, they're being exploited already. Workers are being exploited 50, 300 times by the CEOs. They're making way more money. But in the NBA, even these millionaires, these stars are being exploited. And, I just being a musician, I also drew a parallel in terms of that exploitation with record labels, like how they exploit the artists. I mean, they keep 85% of the profits. They make the musicians pay for their tours and their music videos and their studio time. And so for me, I was already shocked at how exploited they are, how much less they make than the CEOs. But on top of it, that they would use this struggle for just basic human dignity and standing up for their communities against them is really sickening. And I just going back to history now, to World War II. I know this is quite the changing of subject, but in the book, I really appreciated that you brought up World War II, because I feel that not just the UK, but especially the US. I mean, they used their victory in World War II to magnify, to amplify this myth that they are the beacons of democracy in the world. And that any crimes they commit, whether we're talking about the firebombing of Dresden in 45, some people debate that, this was a strategic military target and it had such value, but they decimated that city. There was literally a fireball in it. I mean, it's horrendous. And then Hiroshima, Nagasaki, all of these crimes that were committed, they're wiped from the collective memory. And when they're brought up, there's always an excuse for that. Moreover, I think that their victory helped solidify the myth of American exceptionalism in the world. And do you think that World War II, more than anything else, still has an effect on people's psyche and the collective consciousness in the world? Because I feel like every single war since 1945, every single predatory imperialist action undertaken by the UK and especially the US has been is related to their victory in World War II. And they've been using that ever since to de facto run the world.
Most definitely. A lot of the left, even the most radical elements of the left, and this is unfortunate because the militancy that we need, right, in terms of opposing imperialism, has been really affected by the myth of the good war, this idea that the United States, if there's one instance when the United States was in it for the right reasons, right, militarily, it was because of World War II and the need to defeat fascism. And so in the book, we really tried to expose how the United States wasn't in it to defeat fascism per se. It was in it to defeat competitors, and it was in it,
Right.
and it entered at the latest possible moment to ensure that the Asia Pacific, for example, as well as Europe, would be a primary stage for the United States to build upon the momentum of basically using World War II as an excuse to develop the military-industrial complex and to build its military superiority, while not using it for much of the war until it entered very late. So it's a huge impediment to our ability to oppose wars and fight imperialism, because it's almost like that low-hanging fruit, that idea that even if, and we talk about American innocence here, even if the United States has committed all these crimes from 1787 to today, from its formal constitutionalization to the present, all these war crimes have been committed. But World War II can be commended because the United States was on the right side. This is not to say anything about, as you said, the firebombing of Dresden, which Germany says hundreds of thousands of people died. The United States says only tens of thousands of people. Or the nuclear bombings of Japan, which in the book we talk about how it was a wholly unnecessary act, that the nuclear weapons that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima were not necessary because Japan was already preparing for surrender, and everybody basically knew it. And the United States used this idea that Japan was such a yellow peril, it was such a threat that this was all justified, right? And the same racism being used now against China, that was being used against China then, to be honest, the same race Russophobia that we see was used on the people of Japan to justify that, right? You still have many white Americans who grew up through that period who say words like quote unquote Jap, for example. Like that was the language that was used to justify the use of these bombs. And why were they used? It wasn't for Japan. Japan was ready to surrender. The United States had decimated Japan. If we talk about firebombing of Dresden, what happened to Dresden happened to Japan 20, 30, 40 times over. Japan was destroyed for the most part, and the United States had a huge role to play in that. And so really what the bombs were used for, and this is just consensus among the elite, was it was used for basically the education of the Soviet Union, that if the Soviet Union was going to get too, quote unquote, uppity, for example, if it was to think that it was too much of a superpower after World War II ended, then look at the United States' aerial capacity and look at these heavily deadly weapons, which can cause so much misery at the drop of a dime. And I think that is not ever talked about, not to mention how much the Soviet Union sacrificed. 27 million people Victory Day just passed. And I didn't even put in the book, although I've been following it in the media, 10 million people, Chinese people also died during the war fighting Japanese aggression as well. So that's never talked about in this equation of the good war, quote unquote, because the Soviet Union is bad, socialist bad. China became socialist bad. And so they were the next targets of the US imperialist apparatus. And so the whole staging of this ideological ground of World War II being the United States' kind of moment of ascendancy. It became the richest country in the world. It became the global economic superpower, the military superpower. And it was able to, as workers, as you said, were striking in the thousands, as they were striking, it was able to grant some concessions, build a modicum of a middle class that mostly excluded Black people, and a lot of people were excluded from this. But a section was not, and standards of living rose to a certain degree, at least for a few decades. And that basically allowed for this very conservative American dream ideology, which we talk about a lot in the book, to cement itself among masses of people because the technology, because basically built on military superiority, all this technology, the advancements, building it off of the destruction of World War II, right? The international financial system, which was really stage to bring Europe out of its economic devastation after the war, to enrich financiers based in the United States. All of this helped to build this image, right? So, it's not enough to say that the United States played a good role in World War II because it was fighting fascism. You also have to back it up with the material situation, the objective situation. And so the United States, as it became this ascendant imperial power, was able to do that through granting some of these concessions while also making new enemies on the international arena, and as well as lifting up the image of capitalism in so many ways for a short time, as a means of really building in these very backward, conservative, capitalist and oriented and very much racist ways of looking at the American way of life, which has lasted all the way up until now, where the United States does not even mention what really happened in World War II. It's just always about how it fought for democracy, beat back fascists and the Nazis and the Japanese, regime. And that, in effect, is facts. And so we're left with a very troubling narrative, which does have a huge impact on people's ability to oppose the war machine, especially people who have military experience, for example.
Yeah, it's crazy. I brought up just a few weeks ago that the bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima just as a show of force to the Soviets, and the vast majority of the top brass, the admirals, the generals, the guys in the Pacific, I think they know a bit better than even you and me and all of these people who say that, it was to prevent more deaths and it had to be done. No, I think the guys who were running the American fleets in the Pacific know a bit better, and they themselves said that this was completely pointless and needless, and they were shocked even themselves about this excessive use of force. It was all just to provoke and harass the Soviet Union. And as you mentioned, the Soviets themselves sacrificed more than anyone. I think people often forget that 80% of German casualties in World War II were inflicted by the Soviets. 80% were all by the Soviets. But, you never hear that. It's always, it's the Americans who did everything. And, sometimes the British a little bit. Like, even the British, they try to downplay their role. But, just looking at the timeline, the U.S. didn't enter World War II until after Pearl Harbor, right? Until after 7th December 41. So for 2 years already, they didn't want to have anything to do with it, supposedly, right? So they were happy to provide and manufacture weapons for the British and profit off of it without getting involved and seeming like they're anti-conflict. But you outlined this in the book, and this is documented very extensively, that there was prior knowledge of the impending attack on Pearl Harbor. The oil embargo itself that the United States imposed on the Japanese, they knew that this would have some kind of effect and retaliation eventually, but the attack itself, Pearl Harbor, they had advanced knowledge of it. And it begs the question, why this was not dealt with adequately. And people seem to forget that the military-industrial complex that we talk about today really took on a new dimension in World War II, and the U.S. benefited greatly from this. And so not just ideologically and politically on the international stage as all the beacon of democracy that will go and fight on the behalf of others wherever they are because we're the good guys, but also materialistically and in the form of exorbitant amounts of wealth. So that's often overlooked. And as you said, I think it really is serving the purpose, even unto this day, to justify needless wars constantly, all the time. Before I let you go, I just want to ask your opinion on the shift that you are seeing on the international stage now. Iran, for example, Syria, they all expressed a very clear desire for economic development and prosperity with the Chinese, with the Russians. China are developing the Belt and Road Initiative. Italy signed on to it recently, if I'm not mistaken. I think they're the first and only EU country to do so. Do you think that the Chinese in their foreign policy and economic development differ drastically and completely from the U.S.? Is it really that clear cut? Because you're hearing both sides, right? You have Mike Pompeo on the one hand saying, "Oh, they're liars and they're the imperialists. You know, we're the good guys. They're the imperialists. They're trying to take over everything and they're listening to you with their, you know, through your Huawei phone, and they're essentially accusing the Chinese of every single thing that U.S. companies and U.S. tech companies do and their military does." Or do you think that the Chinese really genuinely have a completely different policy that is based off of mutual cooperation and respect, as opposed to just bombing the crap out of countries and stealing their resources?
I think that question really does outline the huge disconnect, I think, that most people in the United States and much of the Western world have with just the objective trend worldwide. I mean, part of the reason why the United States has become more assaultive in many ways, more aggressive in many ways, wars and the ideological propaganda, the assaults. One of the reasons we wrote this book was to intervene in the fact that American exceptionalism, just the bombardment of it in the corporate media and just the ways in which basically political parties are organized around it, has intensified in recent years. And part of that, especially exiting the sort of the ashes of the war on terror, right? There was this transition period during the Obama period, especially the second half of it, where there was this understanding that the war on terror was basically a fool's errand in terms of making that the principal campaign for the military-industrial complex to wage wars, and that you need to stabilize that situation, continue the general policy, but expand into this great power competition that we're seeing. And one of the reasons why the United States believes itself to be in a great power competition with Russia and especially China is because there's this trend around the world where the ashes of the war on terror, these endless wars, this destruction around the world, the dominance of the international financial system and ensuring that the global south is mired in underdevelopment and poverty, all of that now is coming to a head in governments around the world, Syria being a big one, Iran being another big one, Venezuela being another one, right. The so-called pink tide governments in Latin America. You know, there is this trend, even some African countries now, because of China's ascendancy as an economic power, are saying, we've had enough of this vicious, rapacious austerity, which threatens stability just in general. You can't even have a functioning government, for example, when you're just dealing with the utter poverty and debt, and then to boot add the US's and West's political interference to add on to it. So a lot of countries are looking towards China, and China is looking towards them as well. And I think there's such a misconception in the United States about China because, first of all, there's a century plus yellow peril campaign, and then an anti-communist campaign against China, right, which has very much played a role in why Trump and the Trump administration has been so effective in cultivating it and making it an electoral position as well as just a general policy position to forward the hegemony of the United States. But that centuries plus long racism against China and the peoples of the Asia Pacific is, part and parcel of why we don't why there's so many who understand things like the Belt and Road Initiative and China's foreign policy generally as being quote unquote imperialist, because much of the left has this line that the US and China are equivalents just because China is now an ascendant economic power. But if you look at the world objectively, and you don't just listen, if you don't just read Radio Free Asia and all of the resources that parrot the CIA's mouthpiece, if you see how people of the world view China, it's relatively favorable, especially when you talk about the global south. And that's because China is not going into countries and saying, you need to pick this president, you need to have this kind of government, you need to do things X, Y, and Z way. No, they're saying we have absorbed, honestly, and this is the ironic part, absorbed the technological know-how and resources of Western capital, applied it to our own conditions and
Right.
didn't repeat the disaster that exists in the United States and the West right now economically, right? There aren't economic crashes in China like there are in the US and West. And that's because there is this centralized state that has absorbed lessons, but has not allowed capital to take over. So they go to other countries and say, we have these lessons, we have these resources, we are ascendant as an economic power. You have a lot of resources to help us continue to do that. We'll exchange. We'll exchange the knowledge. We'll exchange the resources, the labor. We'll help you build schools and roads. China will be a huge part of Syria's rebuilding, no
Exactly.
doubt. And we'll do that. And you can keep, your Ba'athist government, your parliamentary government in Syria. You can keep whatever governments exist in, the African continent, whether it's Zimbabwe's government or whatever, maybe the ANC, et cetera, et cetera. Keep those governments, we're not going to interfere in your political life. And we'll try to build, a prosperous overall economic situation for the benefit of both. And I think that is so very dangerous for the United States because it's not so much an ideological struggle as China sees it. China's not trying to say you need to have a communist party that's in the lead in your country and, do things like us. But just by helping to improve conditions in the global South could lead to a complete rupture from a lot of these governments, which for many, in many respects, excluding Syria, Venezuela, et cetera, but many governments on the African continent, many governments in the Middle East, many governments in Latin America, right, have been subservient to the United States politically because there was no other alternative, right? The Soviet Union had fallen. There wasn't this big bloc coming to help. So there was a lot of opportunity for the United States to meddle. Now China as a counterweight and Russia in part are playing this role as developing what they call a multipolar order or an order or world order that's not just determined by the United States or any one country, but that is determined by the options that countries have to decide who they cooperate with, how they work together, and how they develop their societies. And that leads to more conversations politically, that leads to more opportunities for basic infrastructure to be developed in countries where it's been weaponized to prevent those things. That's what the United States and its financial system has done. And so there's so much prospects with this Belt and Road Initiative because China has the public capital, right? This publicly owned, state-owned capital, which can finance these projects without having to impose politicized debt, which then brings countries to this point where they just have to sell up their resources rather than use them to develop their country. And I think that is the big threat here. And for us as anti-imperialists, can be seen as a big hope because it allows for more room for us to champion principles like solidarity, like cooperation, which are going to be critical at the highest level of political struggle, which is the struggle between nations. That is still the highest level. Finance capital and capital, of course, has a huge role in that. But at the highest level, what we're seeing is this struggle between nations and struggle between models of development and models of organizing societies, which ultimately people in the United States have to become involved with if we are going to solve the issues we have here in the United States, because as we have said many, many, many times before, what the United States does abroad shapes entirely how the United States operates here. And how it treats workers and how, how oppressed people are treated, the existence of things like racism, all of that is so interconnected. And so, people call me, whatever, an agent of the CCP or CPC to be not racist about it, because in China, people call the Communist Party of China, not the Chinese Communist Party. But anyway, people say that about me and I'm just like, we have to be more mature about politics, and we have to be able to look at a country of 1.4 billion people that's growing at 6 to 10% per year, that has built a successful country despite centuries plus of misery from colonialism and imperialism. We have to be able to look at that and say, okay, what do we need to learn and how do we engage so this world can be more peaceful? Because if the world is more peaceful, then the United States as an imperialist hegemon is more vulnerable to being forced to change. I don't think many people understand that when the Soviet Union existed and China existed, when there was this socialist threat, that the United States had to really concede a lot, not only to the Black struggle, but also to the working class struggle generally. If we can reach out and oppose this new Cold War and all of its extensions, and Syria is a big part of that, Iran is a big part of it, oppose this new Cold War, this dehumanization campaign and these endless wars, then the pressure is on the US establishment to then respond to the fact that now there's an understanding that there's no interest for people here in this country to be getting on board with some highly expensive and highly devastating military campaign, economic sabotage campaign against these countries. So there's a lot of prospects here, and the hope is that the more we talk about it, the more we agitate about it, the more people will consider the opposing viewpoint rather than just repeating Adrian Zenz or repeating whoever, Colin Powell at the DNC, repeating these talking points about
Don't even get me
around
started.
the world like Russia and China, Syria.
Yeah. Excellent points. Truly, I mean, right across the board. And I found that hilarious. If people call you an agent of the Chinese Communist Party, that's an interesting one. You know, I've been accused of not being Syrian. That's also a good one. They're like, oh no, wow. He's not even Syrian. Like just flat out. Yeah. It's really hilarious. I think it's such an indictment upon how unipolar and narrow-minded a lot of people have become and brainwashed that they are not even willing to address or consider other opposing viewpoints, even when they preach and they are rooted fundamentally in the liberation and the emancipation and in the prosperity of minorities, of countries in the global south. Like all we're just asking is to be treated with dignity and to stop being bombed. Like what is so controversial about that? It's unreal. And so I think that's really an indictment upon how powerful this kind of imperialist propaganda is domestically and abroad. Remember, it's propagated everywhere. It's unbelievable. And, you know, that's why I really appreciate all the work that you did, this book that you wrote, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence. I'm going to put it up on the screen. I've already put it up many times, but once again, I can't thank you enough for this book because it shines such a light on all of the crimes, the genocide against the Native Americans, the lie, this myth about America being the sole force for good in the world and using World War II as a justification for endless war, and so many other things. And people should really go out and get a copy. And I thank you so much to you and to Roberto for writing this book and just all of the amazing work that you guys do at Black Agenda Report as well. It's truly, truly needed, especially in a world where they're trying to censor us even on social media. Like they won't even let us just talk about this stuff. I'm not even talking about just demonetization, but even sometimes flat out deplatforming people that are just expressing an anti-imperialist point of view. So I thank you a lot for that, Danny. And thank you so much for your time, for coming on the show. So where can people get your book? Where can they find your work? And where can they follow you? Please go ahead and plug everything you need to plug. Feel free to do whatever.
All right. Well, I won't take too much time, but definitely get the book. Definitely go to the publisher's website, Skyhorse Publishing. There's an independent bookseller there. So I recommend people buy it from the source they feel comfortable. In terms of finding my work, follow me on Twitter. That's where I'm most active these days on US social media. You can find me at Spirit of Ho, Spirit of Ho. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram through my name, Danny Haiphong. In terms of the work I do, I just joined the Black Alliance for Peace as a co-coordinator of their supporter network. So I highly recommend that, if you're interested in the Black Alliance for Peace and the work they do, please visit the website, become a supporter. I'm also part of the No Cold War coalition, a part of their organizing committee. We're trying to hold international events opposing the new Cold War against China and trying to build some of these linkages that we talked about here. And so, definitely follow me on social media so you can find out when our next events will be. And I think that about does it. You can also definitely check out the new YouTube show that I've been trying to put together with Margaret Kimberly, a Black Agenda Report, called The Left Lens. So, definitely find us on YouTube by searching that. And I really thank you, Richard. I follow your channel. I find it to be refreshing. It's very difficult these days to bring up and agitate around imperialism. Not many people are doing it. And even when people do it, it's not necessarily consistent. And there's a lot of picking and choosing. And so the fact that you're consistent in respecting the self-determination of oppressed people, which I find to be the only antidote to American exceptionalism. It's the only way we're going to get out of this, is if we can somehow build a movement that does respect the self-determination of oppressed people. And it's not even that complex, right? Where no one's asking for you to sign off on how Syria organizes society, how China organizes its society, how Russia, etc. But at baseline, to respect the self-determination of nations, especially oppressed nations, especially those targeted by imperialism, is the fundamental just principle that anyone who calls themselves progressive or leftist needs to follow. And if you're not, then you're not progressive. And I think that needs to be kind of agitated and put out there in your show, because that, every single day that you put something out. So.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. That's the highest compliment and means a lot to me. So, and I totally agree with what you're saying. Like, people need to be very clear about this. It's a very crystal clear, non-complex issue. We just asking for self-determination, the right to self-governance. That's it. So once again, Danny, thank you so much for your time, for all your work. And please say hi from me to Roberto, to everybody at Black Agenda Report, and keep up the good work. Thank you, everybody. Danny Haiphong, follow him on Twitter at Spirit of Ho. All right. So thank you so much, Danny. I'll see you soon, and I'll talk to you shortly. All right. Take care.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.